All right, everybody, welcome. Please take your seats. Enjoy your lunches. All right, trickling in. Fantastic. So we'll just give it a minute till Micere's ready. Then we'll start. Good time to ruffle all those lunches and get them going. I'll have to do that later.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'll just use them. And then well, the spot. No worries. Arrows work and the spotlight works, so we're good.
Ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So welcome, everybody. This is the Mansueto Lunch Colloquium. I think I know everybody, but I'm Luis Betancourt, the director of the Institute. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you. And today it's my pleasure to have a friend and joint faculty with, Micere Keels, who's faculty in Department of Human Development here at the University of Chicago. And she's also been serving with us in our advisory committee, so we're very thankful for that. And in a very interesting group of faculty around the university, a trauma interest group, and she might say a few words about people all over the university, from clinical medicine to human development to other parts of the university interested in issues of trauma generally defined. And so I think her talk will be a little bit on that theme, but also some developments related to offending and traditionally also about growing up in schools. So Micere, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm also, before you sit, person at the back, because all three of you are going to need to come a little bit closer. So I got to grab you. You got to come more than two. Give me a couple more, because we're having a conversation today, which is why it won't work for you to sit all at the way back in terms of this talk. So I'm taking speaker's prerogative to nudge folks a bit closer. So Luis, thank you very much for inviting me, and for the rest of you for indulging me in this conversation that we're going to have today. And for those who are online, because we now live in this hybrid world, Heidi will help to make sure that your voices come in as part of this discussion, because I do want to invite everyone into this discussion. And I'm just giving myself my time check so that I know where I am. As Luis mentioned, I am part of the Trauma Interest Working Group here at the university, which is a program that's supported by Mansueto. And one piece of that, why that's important, is there's actually a model that you're going to see later on in these slides that come directly out of a conversation that group had that was supported by Mansueto, that Luis, you were at pre-COVID years. It's hard to remember, probably like 5 years ago, actually, which is just like amazing that time flies that fast. But a model came out of that conversation that's part of this talk. And so it has been great to be able to talk with and learn from psychiatrists and others of those in the medical school who know a lot more than me about the neurobiology of how trauma affects development, and that is really critical for everything else that we think when we think about trauma and what we want to do in response to the fact that there is so much trauma. Understanding the neurobiology of it, understanding the core changes that it creates in individuals is really critical. So I do a lot of work with schools, and unfortunately, discipline and school discipline and our criminal justice system have too strong a tie. But I do a lot of this work in schools, and it started from work on school discipline in terms of working in schools in the highest So essentially schools that were standard deviation above the city average on crime exposure. And so schools that were located in those neighborhoods, which are also very high poverty and overwhelmingly Black. And thinking about how those schools were responding to the behavioral challenges that were simply a developmental response to coping with high levels of stress and trauma. But they were responding to those challenges as disciplinary problems. And I won't say much more about it, but just that is a lot of intervention work with schools around, well, how can schools do things differently? What capacities do the educators need? What systems need to be in place in order for things to happen differently for kids growing up in those neighborhoods? But out of that and several other connections relating to how trauma affects other aspects of our lives, I ended up doing a paper on that was titled A Developmental Ecological Perspective on the Intergenerational Transmission of Violence. And out of that, was asked by the editors of the Annual Review of Criminology to do this paper that isn't written yet. And so this is a conversation to help me figure out this paper, because I was like, wait, why did I say that? Yes, to doing this. Which is also why I'm clearing my winter quarter, because I need to read a ton because I am in the psychology side of life and the human development side of life, somewhat in the sociological side of life. And I now need to learn a lot around how those involved in law and criminology think about these issues in order to then be able to connect my perspectives and make it legible to those individuals. And so that's what this conversation is about. So a lot of this conversation is around what some of the things that I'm thinking and wanting feedback and thoughts on how does that hit you, and well, what are your questions given, you know, what I've said about something. So that's, you guys are my focus group today. So actually one of my first questions is, what do you think when someone says the association, trauma and its association with offending? Like, what do you think that's about? How do you think trauma is associated with offending? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. There's a bi-directional relationship. Absolutely. And if I add the relationship between trauma and offending and how the criminal justice system should think about and respond to this association. Yeah.
I think a young mother that I like very, very scared for her 2-year-old daughter, but was really struggling with how to parent her. And some conversations we had around what we support her. None of us wanted to call CPS. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to start again? Sure. Your title on the assessment of trauma and its association with offending makes me think of a young mother that I met in a shelter setting who was experiencing homelessness, who was very visibly struggling with parenting her 2-year-old daughter. And it was just very obvious to anyone who would listen to her for a moment that she cared very deeply, but didn't really have the background experience and had trauma in her own upbringing and hadn't seen a lot of examples of healthy parenting. And that we could see how if we didn't come up with an intervention that was going to help her, we were going to have to call Child and Family Services. And none of us wanted to do that because we knew it would make it worse, but it was difficult to think of how to balance the immediate health and safety of the child and helping her mom to know how to interact with her in a way that was healthy.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, one of the important things you said there that you guys recognized, I'm glad that you guys recognized it, is there's an immediate issue or concern, but the potential institutional organization that you were going to call for help was probably going to make it worse. So what does that mean? Like, that is a core systemic and structural problem that we have to think about in this relationship. And that one was the Child Protective Services, which is supposed to be the system that would hopefully help and prevent the child in that scenario that you were talking about end up in the criminal justice system. But these are some of the things that we know. And now my arrows won't even work. Let me see if. Let's try this way. Here we go. So this is some quotes from a study that will be like the final thing that I will share. But I want to start with some quotes, and then we'll talk about some data that explains why these quotes exist. So the first one is, individuals often felt that they transitioned from being viewed as a victim of neglect or abuse into being viewed as an offender. And a typical pathway was involved early referral to the children's hearing system on care and protection grounds. So this is a study that's in Edinburgh. So that's what they call their system. So the pathway to this as an adult started with being referred to what would be considered our child protective system for care, and then experiencing foster care or some other kind of removal from the home, and different forms of residential care over their teenage years. So they were, when they looked at them as an adult, 35-year-old adults, for a good number of them, that pathway into being an offender in the system as an adult began as entering into the system for protection. And so that is a big part of this question, because the criminal justice system is another system, institution and system. And if we're thinking about a big part of the pathway into that system was another system, how does one system, the one that's supposed to punish the adult, how does that reconcile with the fact that the system that was supposed to help that same adult as a child was actually a pathway into this? So how is the system supposed to make sense of that, or should it, or should they think of themselves as two separate systems? So that's one of the big issues that I'm grappling with when I'm thinking about this is, how much do we want to ask that criminal justice system to be accountable to the fact that many of the individuals that are there because the other systems in the institution failed at earlier system points in time. Right now, it is not at all accountable to that fact. So any thoughts on that? System accountability. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna make our microphone holders work today.
Okay, sweet, that's different. Is it possible for them to work justly independent of each organization? Is that possible, you think? If there's so I guess in an ideal sense, they all kind of work together to make sure that somebody isn't hurt at the beginning and then ends up being at the business end of a later one, right? Mm-hmm. Is it possible to make structures where, I think it'd be more ideal if they all work together, but to some degree, no, I guess seeing what I've seen as systems generally, is it possible to make them almost ethical within their own, like within a vacuum? To what degree that's viable, I don't know, but that would be.
So is it possible to hold the criminal justice system, to ask it to be accountable in and of itself, attend to the fact that there were failures in other systems that it did not necessarily have control over, but we're still going to hold it accountable?
Right. It's, I guess, can we the ideal being that we make them all just through the, I guess, through the whole system. But if we can apply to one system and then, I guess, build around that to where they're all the same. Is that possible? Yeah. Those are my first thoughts.
So it seems, Micere, that there's sort of, at least from this example, a conducting line is sort of the life course of an individual, right? And I know you share that from more ecological perspective, but the problem that you have agencies or services that are focused on specific outcomes that tend to happen at different stages in life precludes that connection, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas that's from individual perspective, that's what's going on, right? So it seems like we built the institutions sort of in the wrong way. If you had understood the process better, you built them in a different way. Is that something useful?
That's a good point. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments on?
A big question and confusion I have is essentially when people gain agency, and because like children by the setup don't have agency, adults entering the criminal justice system do have agency. And I mean, this first quote kind of points it out clearly, but at some point there's that transition, but why does that happen? And then why, once the person has agency, are they totally responsible for like whatever that life course history was? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It's a good segue to the next part, that question of agency. That's kind of one of the biggest and thorniest pieces of this, especially when we think about trauma, and especially when we think about the neurohormonal, the biological effects of trauma. So what is it? Couple of things. We often stay here. Most people stay here thinking about acute trauma and chronic trauma. So a single acute is that when you think of some like intense event, where that event itself was intense enough to cause harm to the individual. And we're talking about psychological and emotional and spiritual and other forms of harm like that. Or chronic trauma, where it might be something that's smaller, where one experience of it is not enough to cause traumatic harm, but it's the fact that it's chronic over an individual's life course, that it ends up being what we consider toxic stress and traumatic. So this is generally where most people stay. However, when we start to think about structural issues and structural differences and group level differences, we have to bring in the first two. One is historical trauma. So the fact that in every single country, there are indigenous groups and racial or ethnic groups that have a very different long-standing historical position with regards to power, access to resources, and just trauma from generations in the past that continues, and I'll show later, to be present today. And so that creates group differences in the extent to which people experience acute and chronic trauma. And the idea, the importance of historical trauma is that the problem is that it's never healed. So it's not the sense that, okay, and we'll take slavery in the US. It's not the sense that when slavery ended legally, that remember that those 40 acres and a mule and whatever else was supposed to come with the idea that there has to be some kind of distribution of resources. There has to be some kind of intentional support. And one of the things that I say here when I talk about this is I go to, so this largely I'm critiquing the US. It extends internationally because the same critique, for example, can be done in Australia. It's just different groups that we're talking about and everywhere else. But I'm critiquing the US system, and it allows me to look at, when we look at historical and intergenerational trauma, I use the example of child soldiers. So the US is part of international bodies that go into other countries and say that these individuals, we're going to deem them child soldiers, not gang members, because these individuals or kids were caught up in a historical system where they were forced into this life of crime that created trauma. And so we know for them to become functioning members of society, there needs to be wholesale support for particular groups to reintegrate them into the society, to make sure they have the resources they need. All sorts of work is advocated for going into the US is part of these tribunals, going into other countries to say, well, this has to happen in order for this intergenerational historical trauma to be healed. But we know that didn't happen here with various groups, with many groups, but yet we're able to argue for it in other countries. So we know that it matters. We know that if that doesn't occur, this is going to occur differently. And then the issue is that we have 1 to 4 creates 5 and 6. 5 and 6, 5 is complex trauma. So one individual, most likely in this country to be Black and Indigenous, are much more likely to experience complex trauma, which is acute and chronic trauma from early in their development. This type of trauma is much more likely to create core developmental changes in your biology that has significant effects we'll talk about soon. And system-induced trauma. So remember that was our child protective systems, our schools, criminal justice system, juvenile justice, all of those things. So different groups of individuals at the level of the society, at the level of groups, experience these things differently. And then when they touch our systems, are more likely to be re-traumatized. So question is, how do we hold and to what extent should we hold the criminal justice system responsible for considering this in differences in offending? So that complex trauma is also considered something we call developmental trauma, which is this when trauma occurs early in your developmental history. You are fundamentally and changed at your core with regards to psychological, emotional, and behavioral functioning. That affects all of the things that go into the likelihood of engaging in different forms of offending. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the question of how we ever see the criminal justice system take these things into account. And I'm thinking about sometimes at sentencing, there is, a narrative from the person who's been convicted about, things that have happened in their past that the judge can consider as a mitigating situation and imposing sentence. So I'm wondering what you think about that approach to criminal justice system accountability and how we might imagine it trickling down much, much farther than at the time of sentencing.
That's a good point. So I'm going to go back up a couple of slides. I've been searching. Okay.
Not just.
Mm-hmm. I've been searching for articles. That's the darn thing when you write a review article, is that you have to be able to back up everything you say. So I've been searching for articles that give me some sense of to what extent is it currently considered in the system. And I found one, I'll be searching for more, that say when it is considered, when judges do consider it, is they generally, if anything, will think about and talk about acute, maybe some chronic trauma. But this is the thing that they might take into mind, right? But that still keeps it at the level of the individual and is ignoring all of these other things. And it's all of those other things why you see such huge subpopulation differences in offending. So thank you. Yes. If you know of any other studies, send them my way. But that's the only one that I've been able to find. Yeah.
Are the categories of trauma shown on the previous slide like common teaching within psychology, or like what? Yeah, leave it at
that. No. So it's still pretty much this. Yeah. Generally. Yep. So everything that I talked about, this is actually the most important piece about trauma. Anybody, what does that mean?
The event itself, like people, when they internalize a traumatic event, it's like it keeps playing and they take it to other life experiences, even if the life experience isn't that event. I don't think I'm saying it well, but it's like, so it just reverberates much, much later than the event itself.
Yeah, part of it, the reverberation of it. Yeah.
So I see it like the response to an event, but that is not necessarily just right at the moment, but it's a process that continues right after. And then what she also said about putting into other situations.
Yeah. So to the extent that we think of trauma as the event, we expect people to move on after the event, right? So we will, especially as you get older, you're gonna say, but that happened then. How does that matter for now? How does that matter in this offending behavior that you did? Or how should that matter in my sentencing of it? That happened then. So that's one of the challenges when people think about trauma as an event. But the bigger piece is, so a number that I'll put on later, but I'll just say it now because it matters. Only about 25% of people who experience a traumatic event that's been like identified where they can remember and they've stated your experience is traumatic event, only about 25% of those people go on to engage in violent offending as an adolescent. So one of those challenges that I learned from working in schools was that teachers would say things like, so if there was an incident in the neighborhood, the kids would come back into school on the Monday. And one thing that would really frustrate the teachers and give them a lot of difficulty in deciding how to engage in disciplining students is they were like, but most of the kids seem okay. So that must mean the other ones are choosing to engage in disruptive behavior. It's this, we have an assumption that individuals are all going to respond and behave the same way in response to experiencing a particular traumatic event. And when they don't, we assume that the ones who are acting out are engaging in willful defiance. And so if we think of something as being willful defiance, we're going to punish in one way, versus if we think of it as what I call dysregulation. So an ability to manage impulse control and everything else because your brain and your body is in dysfunction, we're going to respond to it another way. And so the fact that all the kids weren't being dysregulated created this conundrum for teachers about discipline, where it all matters how you think about it. So if I think about it as defiance, I'm going to punish and punish with increasing severity. Yeah.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, there's that one event that maybe all the children experience, but trauma could be viewed as something that's cumulative over someone's lifetime. And there's all sorts of systems that we experience that can be predatory towards whether it's the economic system, financial system, housing insecurity, criminal justice system. All of these things could be predatory and be contributing to that trauma, even outside of that individual's household and their experiences maybe. But all of that can reinforce and create these sort of developmental challenges that are just more severe for certain individuals because of that cumulative effect over a certain period of time. And so it's hard to like just pinpoint this one event. Why is it different? Well, there's all sorts of forces acting on people.
Exactly. That is a big piece of it. So it's cumulative. It's also, trauma is not the event. Any given event, we call some events as potentially traumatic, which means the event could potentially cause trauma. But whether an individual experiences trauma depends on their personal developmental history, on their levels of social support, on whether they receive psychological coping services after, all of those potential things, and there's many others. And so it's actually trauma is to what extent is the individual psychologically and emotionally wounded because of the experience. And so it's needing to know that in order to make sense of the fact that there's so much variability in people's responses to a traumatic event.
Yes, I was just wondering, where does PTSD play into this? Because that's what I thought about immediately when you say it's not an event. Is that something that is recognized? So I just wanted to know how that works in this study. So
post-traumatic stress disorder has a whole complex of symptoms and behaviors in order to, for an individual to receive that diagnosis. And this, which it is very much related to this aspect that trauma is not the event. So when they, studies of incarcerated individuals find that about 80% of them, depending on the study, 75 to 85, 95, depending on the study, have experienced a traumatic event, a potentially traumatic event in their history. But only about, depending on the study, say 10 to 30% are diagnosed with PTSD. But trauma doesn't have to just get expressed as PTSD. So for some, it might be expressed as PTSD. For others, it could be borderline personality disorder. There are many different ways that trauma can be expressed in the symptoms. But PTSD is one of them, but it has a whole set of symptoms associated with it. But that is one of the most kind of recognizable and understood ways that trauma shows up in people's behavior. Yeah.
So your example of the students responding to the traumatic event in the neighborhood brought back to me this question of agency, because your characterization of the school's response assumes that any aberrant behavior is like some agency, yeah, which I never actually thought of it this way, but that means that the criminal justice system and the schooling system both treat agency and children differently, where you know, for the criminal justice system, you're not a person until you're 18, then you are. And then for a school, you're just always your own person. And I guess if you act out enough, then teachers start to question if there's something going on at home, and then we'll dig deeper and question that agency. But yeah, there's a bit of a paradox there that just synthesized for me. So thank you.
My reaction also to the example of like children who maybe there was a violent event in their neighborhood, what that makes me think of is that teachers might also ask themselves, okay, well, which students lived closest to where that event was, or, you know, did any of these students see it firsthand versus just hear about it from their friends? And that can also be misleading. And the example it makes me think of is and this is just something I've learned like anecdotally from people, that if there is, for instance, a household where abuse is taking place, sometimes the trauma is more complex for people who did not experience that abuse directly but heard it, or otherwise it was around them but maybe were not the direct victim in that case, and that can be very counterintuitive. So it just, yeah, made me think of that extra layer of complexity.
Yes, trauma is exactly that. It's complex. So the kind of underlying piece why trauma is not the event is trauma results from how we process or don't process the event. It's about how we make sense of it or not. And if we can't make sense of it, we stay in this chronic, hyper-vigilant space where we feel like we've lost our sense of safety. Oops, sorry. Sure. Feeling like we've lost our sense of safety, and that developmental challenge through your life course then puts you at risk for engaging in several behaviors or responding to situations in a way that continually reactivate the trauma. And that's a piece where systems currently as they operate often make trauma worse. So if there's an incident that happens in your home that causes you to lose your sense of safety and overwhelm your coping, and then you're pulled out and put into the child welfare system, that is not a system that restores any of that. And so often with that traumatic event and being pulled into the child welfare system, you'll be engaging in challenging behaviors and oppositional behaviors because you're struggling to adjust and adapt and cope. And just because the way that trauma affects impulse control, reactivity, and that system is more likely one that's going to punish all of those behaviors. And so you're just in this chronic cycle that starts through a system that's intended to protect, but often makes things worse. And just the care in that system is not care. So I want to come back to our brains for a second. This is a very rough heuristic. Just the idea that we have, our survival brain, our emotional brain, and our really logical thinking brain, and that we come into this world with a pretty well functioning survival brain, and everything else essentially develops through learning, right? So this is where we're at. This is another way of representing that considers trauma. So I'll just quickly put those up. And what those numbers indicate is the amount of your brain processing that's being spent in those different areas of your brain. And the idea is that you want to spend the most of your processing as you grow and mature in the higher thinking areas, because that is what allows you to inhibit your instinctive response. That's what keeps you out of the criminal justice system, being able to inhibit your instinctive response to a situation. And individuals who experience trauma, this is one way of thinking about what happens differently to the way their brain functions. So there is overactivation in their brainstem and midbrain. And so they're more likely to be responding from this instinctive, impulsive, emotional space. And there is less activation in that higher thinking area. And so these are changes to you, the way that your brain functions because of the way trauma and the stress reactivity system affects our bodies. So if we, again, back to the criminal justice system, if we're saying, well, folks who are experiencing trauma, especially chronic trauma, their brains are functioning differently. The way the blood flows in their brain, the systems that get they get activated first and get activated the strongest, it's functioning differently. How should the criminal justice system think about that? Were you about to?
I don't understand the numbers.
Oh, so the numbers were just, so ideally it would be the 6, 8. So ideally it would be like the amount of processing. So more processing, the 16 was just more processing at the higher level. So let me flip back. Ooh.
The numbers mean something specific?
No, it's just a ratio. I'm trying to go back.
Okay, maybe I shouldn't be worrying about it so much.
No, so it's the ratio. So you see this ratio?
I see twice as much time in the upper
Right.
2 versus the lower 2.
Right.
Okay. Gotcha.
And so it's just, and that's where like those clear aspects of the box is there. It's just the ratio is shifted. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks.
But it's totally just a heuristic. Like any neuroscientist would just be cringing right now. Yeah, this is just to make it so that we can see that there's overactivation here and there's less activation up there, which means it's the impulsivity has increased and the ability to inhibit and engage in impulse control has decreased. So is there any corollary that anybody can think of with how the criminal justice system thinks about cognitive functioning? It assumes that, yes. Individuals who've experienced traumatic brain injury, individuals who are deemed to have a very low IQ, how does the criminal justice system think about and make considerations for those individuals?
I think they're like Supreme Court rulings where they basically just say we don't take it into account, and they treat, people been sentenced to death who had, child level development at a child developmental level, and it's just not considered. I think I'm not a lawyer here, but.
Anybody else?
I guess excuse me if it's a lack of knowledge or ignorance on my part. I've always been under the understanding that if you meet a certain threshold of, I guess it'd be cognitive disability, you would be in a ward as opposed to a prison. But I don't know if that may also be like a lack of knowledge of current standards too. But that's to some degree how I've understood it.
Yeah, so I can say I'm still trying to figure this out. I don't, and I'm still trying to figure out what the corollaries are existing today with regards to, if we think about the fact that brain functioning is altered and changed, how should we think about that in the criminal justice system? And it's altered and changed in ways that directly affect the likelihood of violent offending.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the distinction between someone being born with diminished capacity of some variety and someone having experiences over time that lead to this kind of situation up on the slide from trauma. And guessing that there's probably not a very good differentiation in either, well, in the law, maybe there is one in science about how to understand those two things, right? I suppose, not guilty by reason of mental defect could be an analogy to something that happened over the life course in some way that might be analogous. I don't know.
Yeah, and to kind of, I'm sorry, to expand on that a little bit, I was thinking like mental illness, where does that come into play with the criminal justice system? Because that's often overlooked. We hear terms like criminally insane. What is that exactly? What does that look like versus just evil? You know, we often hear that. So I would be curious as to how that's looked at and how that comes into play overall.
So I don't know if by criminal justice we're including police, but I think policing, it's how like the strategies, the monitoring, the understanding of crime and criminalization of certain groups, all that would need to change, understanding this.
So I have two folks that are just like struggling to try to figure out what you want to say, but I see you keep raising and lowering your hand.
That's me thinking out loud. Yeah, sure. I guess it seems to me that one of the tricks here is whether it's about punishment or integrating somebody back into society, and that's really one of the clear themes that you've been hammering on.
Yeah. So way back in back in undergrad, I thought for a moment I wanted to go into criminology, and I took a course and I was like, this is insane. Because I thought this system only works if you will lock people up forever. This system does not work if people will return to the community. And I retreated back to psychology. Because that for me was, I was like, well, everything that we know about development, how does the system work the way it does? And so for me, this is partially a return to thinking about those things, but being allowed to consider mental health and trauma as part of the issues.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets at what I've been struggling with in my brain, which is I think it's really important to have the discussion we're having around like how and why do we hold people responsible for certain things based on their life experience or their mental capacity, or all of those get really sticky for me and probably for everybody very quickly. Because I have a little brother with Down syndrome, and the choice that my family made was when he turned 18 to seek legal guardianship. And there's a really long process you have to go through to determine and prove before a court of law that the person you want to take guardianship of as an adult is not capable of making their own medical decisions, their own financial decisions, and that they need long-term care. And that system is very complicated, probably as it should be, because I've heard stories of people being abused in those situations who really probably didn't need that level of intervention. And like, that's talking about taking someone's rights away as well as their responsibilities, right? And so I don't know how to parse this out, because I also want there to be like smaller sentences and accounting for trauma, but I can imagine this system, I guess, interpreting things in such a way as, well, if we're not going to hold you responsible for something that you did, then that can become another way to take away rights. And I don't like that idea either. So it's that thing of how to parse out that many people, their agency is perhaps reduced because you're trying to survive, but also I don't know that it's helpful to permanently like pathologize people by saying your agency is like permanently reduced. Like that doesn't lead to rehabilitation either. So I'm thinking at extremes there, but that's kind of what this is bringing up for me.
Thank you for that. So the issue of holding people responsible and agency. So my work, I think of as fitting into the developmental and life course theories of crime, which basically considers that crime shifts over the engagement in offending, has this life course trajectory that we have to make sense of. And I'll use a data slide to, what my piece is that these theories don't consider structural violence. And to me, structural violence, a big, huge one, is racism and poverty. And that they live in present day ecological factors of the context in which people are growing up in. And that context is traumatizing. So I'm going to skip most of this because I've talked about them. Not even going to go there. But this is the model that came out of that conversation, and it informs a lot of what I'm going to try to fit into this review article. So this was essentially just making the note that trauma, memory, and retrospective versus prospective studies. So a lot of what I'm leaning on for this review article is going to come from prospective cohort studies on violence, where they know what has happened to children early in their development and over the life course, and then are also tracking offending over the life course. And it's really critical, the idea of thinking about whether these are prospective or retrospective studies, because remember, trauma affects your cognitive functioning, which is going to affect your memory. And also, one of the ways that some people keep themselves safe from harm of trauma is by suppressing memories of events. So all of those things I think are important to think about when we think about the science on these studies. So what is credible evidence going to come from? And I think it really has to be the prospective cohort studies. So this is one of them. The other thing that I think, and you guys tell me, I think it's going to be helpful to look at studies outside of the US. To talk to folks in the US, I'm going to have to get data from other countries, because there are too many issues of race and how we think about race that would cause people to dismiss a lot of evidence from prospective studies in the US. So that's what I think for having a bunch of conversations. So I'm going to leave the country to look at work to convince people how to maybe think a little bit differently about their own system. So from this cohort study, this is the main graph that I want you to think about. So what we have is this one, dark one at the bottom, is no conviction over the life course from age 13, but they had data from earlier, but they looked at criminal justice system contact from 13 to 34. These individuals were later onset, and they generally could find a trigger of event that happened in their lives or something that was associated with that later onset. You have these two. These folks are chronic from early. They had criminal justice system contact from early, and it persisted in offending. And these are the ones who have that traditional adolescent young adult bump increase and then desist. These individuals rarely don't desist. One. This is the convictions. It's heavily influenced by poverty, because they have two things in the study. They have convictions, but they also have the individual's reports of engagement in criminal activities. So individuals who are not poor, it's not that they're not engaging in criminal activities, is that those activities rarely end in conviction. So for me, that's one of those structural factors, is thinking about poverty, because that's going to determine whether engagement in activities, so this is conviction again, but so when you think about this no conviction group, it's not that they weren't similar percentages of them engaging in offending. It's just whether that engagement in offending led to conviction. And if we think about system-induced trauma, one of the other things from this study is that contact with the system increases the likelihood of further contact. So if you happen to have the resources to keep your child out of the system, or get out of this, or either keep them from the system getting into the system at all, or keep them from getting convicted, you have a high chance of them having positive outcomes, even though they may have engaged in offending as an adolescent. So that is critical. how do we think about poverty? And of course, when we bring this back to the US, there are significant racial and ethnic differences in household and neighborhood poverty, which is then determining your contact with the system. And then whether you are caught up in a system. So one of the things that I said in that earlier paper that I did was anything from the earliest age, like my one recommendation was anything but any kind of incarceration and juvenile justice, anything but that, because we know as soon as you touch that system and as soon as you enter any kind of protective custody, you are significantly likelihood increasing in terms of traumatic events that then it just becomes a recursive system. And so then lastly, the other thing, or the one to put up from this is, so this is the likelihood of being in the later onset, the blue, which is the adolescent offending, and then desistance, and then chronic. So this is the worst one, right? Chronic offending that never desists. The two biggest things in that are that you experience some form of school exclusion at the age of 12, and you had some kind of contact with the police, even if it's just a warning. One of the biggest findings from this study was that any kind of formal system sanctioning essentially kicks you significantly up your likelihood into being in this chronic offending pathway. So it's just how much our systems take early, and also if you are being kicked out of school at 12 or contact with the police at 12, you're like 99% likelihood of having traumatic events in your early childhood history, right? So it's this idea of early childhood trauma connects you with the system, and then through that connection with the system, it leads you into this chronic offending pathway. That's all I have at this point in time.
We're more or less on time, but if you don't mind staying a few more minutes, and if people want to stay, they can. But if anyone needs to leave, they can leave. So with that, I have lots of questions, but I'll let others go ahead.
So by looking at the last graph, I was curious about how you think about like gender differences, because we see like eviction, but for other numbers we know like majority of them are like men. What happens with women that are also experiencing a lot of traumatic experiences since early in their lives, and like how do you also measure those effects like later in life?
So I can say yes, there is this higher significance for being male associated with offending, but so trauma has the same effect for women. There's just a main effect of gender, but within each gender, experiencing trauma early in life has a significant effect on same for both groups.
I was wondering if you've engaged at all in some of the more local work on alternative responses, in particular, like the treatment not trauma ordinance is one that's gotten a little attention. It's interesting because their approach is more focusing on, trying to divert as many calls to the police away from like police who really aren't trained to respond to things like homelessness, substance abuse, and other kinds of offenses that may be better classified or responded to by like social workers or counselors. But I was curious to hear if you've engaged with that at all and what your thoughts were.
No, I haven't really engaged in that locally. I've been in some national conversations with some groups that are working to, so this came out of my engagement with a group called Square One, and they're trying to just thinking that the justice system that has to go back to square one and thinking about how would we reimagine the system if we were to just build the whole thing differently. But most of my work around this really is in schools, and it's in the space of it, just actually for my own mental health and well-being, in the space of how do we keep kids out of the criminal justice system. I have done some like minor engagement with the criminal justice system, and for me, it's like I need to be in that space of, I know what happens when they touch that system. So how can I do the work of changing the system, another system that could keep them out of that one? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. It reminded me very much of, I guess some of the reasons I came here were, Robert Sapolsky's work. It felt very, very relevant to that, especially when you talked about the effects of long-term trauma. And then to some degree, it made me think of Sujatha Baliga's work as well. And it is in restorative justice. It was one of the MacArthur Genius Grant winners out of, I think, San Francisco. She did an interesting thing where she had a rough childhood, and a lot of it was trying to bridge that gap between how does she deal with that anger and how does she, because no amount of punishment is really going to make things better necessarily, as much as she wants to feel like that won't happen again. And I was interested to some degree how, so in acts of violence, there's the, I guess, the punishment aspect, right? And then how do you deal with making, so we want to be fair to the person that's being, I guess, the quote unquote punished in this case, but we also want to be fair to the person that was, I guess, had this inflicted on them, right? I know there's, I had my own run-in previously coming to Chicago, and there's a place on whenever you're, I guess, applying charges, whether or not you're welcome to have them contact you after they get out. And I know that even it's very much like, my mindset was very much like a sympathetic one, but it felt hard to like enact my values in that space. And like I was able to, but it's a space that it's a difficult space to manage. And how do you manage what is essentially that anger, or however people manifest that?
Yeah.
With also wanting to be compassionate towards the people who committed those acts.
So I don't have much to say about the individual level of management of that. And that's only because one, like that's a long conversation. And there are a lot of, and I've had the pleasure of being in rooms with folks that are thinking that through from the perspective of having experienced tragic loss, death, murder in their family. And arguing for restorative justice, but I know the walk that they have had to go through to be able to be in that place. So I just don't feel competent to speak to that at individual level. But I can't speak to it what I speak to it at is at the community and society level. And again, it's the space of, and I can have that conversation in a very compassionate way with somebody who has experienced individual loss. But my conversation is around, but if this person is going to come back into the community, let's talk and think about that. Because I know that they also want to have a safe community. And that's when you can have some of that conversation is around if the person is going to be coming back into the community, then we can have a bit of that. That's where I can speak to some of that conversation around how do we balance these things.
I was just wondering, what other countries are you wanting to go to? I don't know if you meant literally you are leaving the country to go study elsewhere, or just like,
well, I am for a minute, but not for this valid. Is just, I'm not going to do a 35-year longitudinal study, but there, thankfully, some of several European countries have done really good cohort studies. And so I am looking at their reports and things from their cohort studies to as part of being able to show the effects of trauma on offending, and then bringing it back to the conversation here in the US.
So that's like the Edinburgh example.
Edinburgh, and there's one in, I think it's a Danish one is the other one that I'm going to be investing and engaging in, yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking about my last question, and I think my question also has to do with like what happens with women because they experience similar trauma and the effects are similar, but they're not engaging in offending with the same frequency that men. I think is it like
There's there actually an easy answer to that?
Okay. Are there coping mechanisms or what? Okay.
You know what it is? Children.
That's right.
They have to care for their children. And that enforces, that shifts things. So that's a slight difference between men and women is the ability that society gives men to go off and engage in these behaviors more. But if there's children, it's more likely that the woman is going to be responsible. So they've shown that with homelessness also. So homelessness is as a pathway, as risk factor for many of these factors. But women who also similarly enter into homelessness are more likely to recover and come out of it because they're more likely to have children. And so that forces them having that responsibility for that person that you have to figure out, like, I got to find another way. And so that's that pressure, that push. So that's one of the differences between men and women where things might be a little bit differently. But there are several other things, but that's one example. Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Micere, again. This is wonderful. And it was a great format to have. Thank you for allowing us to have this discussion with you as well. So you're at the university, so I see that many people are interested in your work. So don't be shy, I think. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for indulging.